Okay, so now we're going to talk about graphing cosine, okay? Now, if you remember, cosine is always your x-coordinate. So if we look here at the cosine values, right, at our special angles of pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, we can see, right, we have all positive values here. And if you evaluate at 45 degrees, like here, cosine would be 1 over rad 2, right, which would rationalize to rad 2 over 2. So the cosine value, right, is rad 2 over 2 at 45 degrees, okay? So on the unit circle, they have each of those values labeled, okay? At 0 degrees or 0 radians, right, the x-coordinate is 1. At 90 or pi over 2, the x-coordinate is 0, all right? Then you can see we start to repeat the values, except now, because we're in the second quadrant, and this is cosine, right? The values are now negative, right? Because the x values are negative, right? Then when we get to 180 degrees, we have an x value of -1, all right? Then you continue, they're negative, they repeat themselves again, right? It gets smaller and smaller. Then they get to 0. And then, right, they increase again to a value of 1. And then you've hit all the values. Again, the period of cosine is going to be 2 pi. So what I've done is I've taken these values, right? Remember, rad 3 over 2 is, right, about 0.9, right? I think it's 0.86-ish. This is 0.7. That's 1/2, right? 0.5. And then I use those values and I filled out this table. So if you want to hit pause and fill out this table, I've taken those values and put them here. But you can see there's now a difference, right? Cosine starts at a value of 1, whereas if you look back, sine starts at a value of 0. So cosine starts at 1, decreases to 0, becomes negative, then hits a minimum of -1, and then comes back. And then because it's a periodic function, after 2 pi, it returns to a value of 1, okay? So we're going to graph this exactly like we graphed sine. We're going to start at 0, okay? Then this is going to be, our critical points are always going to be pi over 2, right, unless we transform it. Pi, which is 180, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi, okay? And then we can put these guys in, so pi over 6, and you're not going to have to plot all these points when we get to graphing these guys a little bit later on. This is halfway, pi over 4, right, because that's 45 degrees, and then we have pi over 3, and then taking from the table, it's 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 4, and then 5 pi over 6, okay? So if we plot these at 0, a theta of 0, okay, we will have a value of 1. And I'm going to label my y-axis just like I did for sine, -0.5, and then -1. So we're going to start high here, okay? Then we're going to hit 0.9. So we're decreasing, but it's not a line, okay? It's still a curve. This is 0.7, so that's about here. And then we hit 0.5, and then we hit 0 at pi over 2, or 90. Then here, we'll go all the way down to -0.5, then 0.7, and then much closer to 0.9, then -1. So you can see our curve starting to form. This is my minimum. Then if you remember, right, we're going to get less negative, so we're going to come back up. At 3 pi over 2, we hit 0. And then at 2 pi, we will hit 1. Now, if we continued, this would go back down, okay? Because the values would then repeat themselves, and we'd have 0.9, 0.7, right, because of the periodic nature. So that would go down, all right? But if we want the other side of our graph, remember, this is going to be negative pi over 2, negative pi, right? Negative 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi, negative 2 pi, I should say. And then I'm going to repeat the same pattern. So if I hit 1, right, then at negative pi over 2, I'm going to hit 0, come back down, right? Then I'm going to have at negative pi, negative 1. Then at negative 3 pi over 2, I'm going to hit 0, and then I'm going to hit my maximum. Notice again, a curve, do your best. I'm not going to get too crazy about that, but I wanted to see be a curve. These are called sinusoidal curves, okay? Now, domain, range, same idea. We could continue graphing this. So this is negative infinity to infinity. My range is going to be, right, negative 1 to 1 inclusive, all right, because we actually hit those values. My amplitude, again, I have a midline right down the middle of this guy on the, or sinusoidal axes here. So my amplitude is still 1. Okay, always positive. And then my period, unless again I transform, we start at 1 at 0, we go through the whole cosine function, and we return back to 1 after 2 pi, right? And usually you'll see we're going to graph in terms of radians, okay? So that is an introduction to graphing cosine, all right?